Well, good evening, Mpumalanga. Are you alive and well? I heard you had a fantastic night last night. Very sad I couldn't be with you. In hindsight, I think I should have been here. I've been watching my son play cricket and that didn't go too well. So I should have been building God's kingdom, right? But really good to be here. Mpumalanga is like a hidden treasure. Yes? It's memorable. I think if anyone comes into these parts, they go back just very warm and remembering just amazing people and amazing moments. I haven't been here for years before we came here. I think it was in March to visit Guy and Cheryl in their church. And we went on a bit of a game drive. And it was our first game drive and we saw a pangolin. Wow. At that point, we knew God was going to do amazing things in the weekend. We felt very privileged and chosen by God. But I actually felt, for Mpumalanga, it's almost like Mpumalanga is like a pangolin. It's rare, it's choice, it's of high value, it's special, it's precious in the eyes of God. And anyone that comes in contact with this region goes back changed. I've told the story of the pangolin wherever I've gone. Because this is how it went. I was in the vehicle and the game ranger, he says to me, "What would you like to see?" I said, "Male lion." He says, "That's a tough ask first up, but let's give it a go." I said, "What do you want to see?" He said, "Pangolin." I said, "What's a pangolin?" I'm from Durban, I don't know what that is. He described it to me. I said, "Why do you want to see a pangolin?" He said, "I've done my master's in the tree pangolin. I've never seen a pangolin in real life." So I said, "Well, that's great. Let's see what happens." 2 hours in, the sun's going down. The tracker stops the vehicle and says, "Pangolin," right there. You know what's amazing? That game ranger started weeping. The guy started crying in front of us. He got down on his knees. It was a memorable moment as he came in contact with the pangolin. That's what this region is like for people that come and visit it. Be encouraged. To all of you that are leading churches all around, maybe you might feel like it's in the armpit of the Lowveld. Keep going. You're the pangolin. Amen. Okay, I'm going to get on to what I want to share tonight. I want to talk about a topic that has to do with leadership, and I want to make a presumption that all of us are leaders or aspiring to be leaders, or at least leading your own environment. And I want to talk a little bit about momentum. I've shared this message in 1 or 2 places, but momentum is an amazing thing. Would you agree? When you've got it, it's amazing. When you don't have it, it's what you aspire to. If you don't have momentum, it can feel like you're pushing up, and then you plateau and you're pulling along, and you're just waiting for that dip down the hill where there's momentum, and it's just like, this is what I was created for, right? And here's the truth of the matter is that momentum isn't just given to us as we step onto the earth. Momentum is something that we long to build with, but it comes through trials, it comes through just keeping on. It comes through much prayer. It comes through asking God and laying hold of the future. And so when I look at my leadership journey, in fact, it started out with Guy Feldman, yours truly. I was 13 years old. He was my youth leader, and he said, "Lead a small group." That was a crazy thing to say for those poor young people. And I remember that first meeting. They went inside to meet, and I couldn't bring myself to go inside because that meant I had to lead them. So I stayed on the outside and nearly vomited my lungs out. That's how nervous I was. And that was how it started. And then through my school years and into my 20s, and at times there was momentum, at times there wasn't. I remember leading in a big environment where it felt like there were more chairs than there were people. Yes. And thinking, "Oh God, take me home." And then other arenas where there's more people than there are chairs, and you think this is momentum. But what does momentum look like from God's perspective? And I want to have a look at something from a very simple grid tonight. So what is the enemy of momentum? The enemy of momentum is inertia. Now, if you've done science, which I did do, and I don't remember too much, but here's a definition of inertia. It's a tendency to do nothing or to remain unchanged. It is where a property continues in its existing state unless that state is changed by an external force. And so either I'm stuck and I have no momentum, that's inertia, or I'm trundling along and nothing is changing. It's just the same old all the time. until an external force comes in, knocks me off my perch, or shoots me forward, or something happens. That's how momentum takes place, as I understand it. Now, let me give you a little example. My sons go to the school. It's middle of the road. They have got about 1,400 students. It's the same school that Ryan goes to. It's in Durban North. And many of you wouldn't have even heard of the school. But they decide to do a war cry, which many schools do. And what they did in this war cry, they took a Drake rap, they wrapped it out, and it ended with this little thing called Flip the Switch. They videoed that, they put it out onto social media with a few thousand followers, and Drake got hold of it. And Drake reposted it. Drake has got something like 60 million followers. Suddenly, this school goes through the roof in terms of their followers. 5 million views of this little silly video, and they're into the mainstream. That's called momentum, right? Beforehand, they were in the backwaters of Durban North doing their little thing, and something happens that changes their momentum. Now, how does inertia set in? Really, the conclusion that I come to is that it's not what you know, it's who you know. And when you translate that into a Christian sense, it's not all that you fill your head with, it's who you plugged into. That creates momentum. So how does inertia set in for the believer and for the leader? I think it sets in through overuse. I think there may be some people here, when you look at your life and when you look at your leadership, you might say, I've come to a grinding halt. And why is that? It's not because I don't love Jesus. It's just been the knife that started out sharp has become blunt. It's like a spoon. It's just not going through in the same way as it used to. That might be you tonight. Another reason that inertia sets in is through trauma. Trauma can create paralysis, where I don't feel like I'm able to move in a direction. I don't know even whether I can move sideways, backwards, forwards. I'm just traumatized. You might be there tonight. Another reason that inertia sets in is because of fear. Let's be honest that not everyone sees the state of our hearts and our minds. They see how we masquerade as people, but they don't see on the inside, and fear can set in. Fear of failure, fear of the future in this country, to do with your kids, to do with your leadership space. And so I want to take us to a very simple text that we may know well, but I want to read it and mine it for a bit and then have a look at some application. So here's the text. It's out of 1 Corinthians chapter 3. As Paul writing into the context of a church that is actually on steroids. Let me put it like that. The gifts of the Spirit are operational. There's things happening, but he's instructing them fairly firmly on a whole lot of things. Divisions, immorality, the way their meetings should take place, the way that they're building. And he has this big idea in 1 Corinthians chapter 3. He talks about there being a foundation that should be laid on which we build, and that's Jesus Christ. No other foundation should be the foundation on which we build, right? And he goes at this idea that only God can make things grow. Isn't that good news? That's fantastic news. So let's have a look at it. This is his perspective, I'm saying, on momentum. Verse 6 of 1 Corinthians chapter 3 says, I planted the seed, Apollos watered it, but God has been making it grow. So neither the one who plants nor the one who waters is anything, but only God who makes things grow. The one who plants and the one who waters have one purpose, and they will each be rewarded according to their own labor. For we are co-workers in God's service. You are God's field, God's building. Paul is making this refreshing, robust assault on his audience as to what really creates momentum, what really growth is. If growth only comes because of my hand and my intellect, is that really growth, is what he's really asking. And so, how does he deal with this issue of growth and who's responsible for what? I'd like to have a look at a few things that he suggests. Firstly, he has a look at my part, and he also has a look at God's part. Here's some lessons to learn. Number one is that work is part of the equation. That's a given. We have a responsibility to work. From before the fall, work was part of God's perfect creation, and that's a good thing. So there's no sidestepping my part, there's no sidestepping work. The second thing is that my value is not attached to my work. Now that's very challenging because many of us, we get up in the morning and we look at what we're going to do and what we're going to accomplish, and our value is defined by that thing. And Paul's saying actually zero value is attached to what you do and what you don't do. Your value is defined by being a child of God, by being a son of a father or a daughter of a father in heaven. That gives you ultimate value. He uses this thought of neither one is anything. Whether you planted, whether you watered, whether you were present, whether you were not present, you're nothing. It's God. Number 3, it doesn't matter who does the work. Okay? And for some of us, we sing that as the moment to get off the hook. Others of us that are driven by significance, we look at that and say, I don't really like that. But he's saying it doesn't really matter. A nameless and a faceless generation, that's really what it's about. It doesn't matter who does the work as long as the work gets done. Fourthly, he says there's reward for our work. In other words, it keeps us motivated to know that we will be rewarded for working and investing into the kingdom. And fifthly, he says, not everything grows at the same pace. I struggle with this because I want to know that if you put a seed in the ground there and you put the same seed in the ground there and the same seed in the ground there, that they all, under the same conditions, they grow at the same rate. And somehow in the kingdom, things don't always grow at the same rate. Yes? And that can unravel me. And yet it's kingdom. And God does things in His timing. And we look back in hindsight and say, sure, if He had have done that then, that would have been a disaster. But He did it there. And the sixth thing that really He rams home is this idea, is that only God makes things grow. And so, we're going to have a look at some practical application. But if I don't believe that God makes things grow, that I'm part of the process, that I'm co-laboring with Him, that I've got my part to do, if I don't believe that ultimately God makes it grow and creates some momentum, I'm not going to sleep very well at night. I'm going to live with high anxiety. I'm going to live stressed out. I'm going to take it out on my family and my relationships. I'm going to be on the hamster wheel of success that's really worldly, without opening my hands and trusting God. God makes things grow. And so I want to encourage us tonight, friends. I want to encourage you. Some of us need to tighten the harness a bit in terms of taking responsibility and possibly saying, I've got a part to play in advancing the kingdom and stepping up and leading and taking hold of and opening my eyes to the possibilities that God wants to use me for. Me? No, not me. Yes, you. Others of us need to open our hands and say, God, I've been trying to make things grow. I've been watering and planting and trying to create the momentum, and ultimately that's your part, God. And I'm so grateful that you make things grow. And so, what is our part in building momentum? Let me tell you a little story. I went to Windhoek earlier this year, and myself and Ray Oliver have been working with the church for about 5 or 6 years, going through transition. And this was the transition year. And these guys had asked us to come to the elders planning. Now, I didn't know what they had in mind, because elders planning is about elders planning, right? Elders planning. I'm from outside. I'm not one of the elders, but would I come along just to take a look in? So I said, absolutely, would be delighted. I asked him, what's the program? What do you have in mind? What would you like me to do? Radio silence. So I didn't get too much of a brief. I thought to myself, I should prepare, right? So I get onto the plane, and I had some thoughts, but I get onto the plane and I'm thinking, what happens if I get into the elders planning and they hand over to me? So I think to myself, okay, this is what I'm going to do. Elders planning is about planning for a local church looking into the future. And I drew a line on my page, and on the one side, I asked the question, what am I called to manage faithfully? And what am I called to pioneer? Those 2 questions. What am I called to manage faithfully? And what am I called to pioneer? And then I closed my book. And I flew into Windhoek, and I was still very much anticipating that the elders were going to do elders planning. Have I stressed that enough? And so I get into the meeting. It was from 8 o'clock till 5 o'clock. They'd hired out this place. And as we got there, they said, okay, guys, let's gather together and let's pray. I was hoping they'd pray for long. They didn't. It was an opening prayer. And then they said, it's really great to have you, Mark, over to you. Just like that. I'm very glad I did my planning so precisely. And so I said, listen, I've been thinking and praying for you. And they had a whiteboard there, so I took a Koki and I drew a line on the board and I said, God's called us to manage some things faithfully and God's called us to pioneer. What are the things in the life of your church that God's called you to faithfully lay hold of and manage? And they began to write things down and they began to talk them through. What does this look like? Are we being faithful with these things? And we went through for a few hours. Then we had a look at what are the types of things that God's called you to pioneer. What's God called your church to? You could apply this to business. You could apply this to your family. Where am I called to pioneer, to walk in faith? And we wrote down a whole bunch of things. Very fascinating. We went through each of these things one by one. And we got to this thing of God's called us to plant churches. Now, this church has been going for 46 years. So I said, have you planted any churches? No, we've never planted a church out of here. Is that, I spoke to the gentleman who was leading, I said, is that a desire of yours? It's been a dream of mine since we started this church 46 years ago. As he says, I'm dreaming of planting a church. Another gentleman, an elder, says, there's 50 people that come to this church. It's too expensive for them to take public transport, but they come nonetheless. They come from that part of the city. I think we can plant a church. And another guy says, I've got the guy to plant the church. And he says, his name is Mark. I said, it's not me, it's another Mark. Fascinating. I went back to Durban, mind blown, thinking just asking these simple questions can actually propel momentum into the life of any environment. I believe God's called us as believers to live like that. Managing faithfully, because as we're faithful with little, God entrusts much to us. But then asking God, where are you calling me to pioneer? So, for the sake of tonight, I've got a very simple diagram. It's a tree that says, you can remember only this. God is the trunk. He makes things grow. From Him, everything stems out. And the faithfulness branch is what I'm calling consistency. And the pioneering branch is what I've called creativity. And we're going to mind that for a few moments. So how do I build with consistency? I've got a few thoughts. Firstly, consistency sees beauty in the mundane. I think many of us can get bored so easily. We're looking for change at every level, at any level. And actually beauty is found in the mundane, in the everyday, in fair weather. It's okay. We were in a small group once and everyone was talking about all their problems, all the anxiety, all the issues. And it got round to this one lady and she's ambitious. She's chasing the dream at every point. And she stopped us and she said, I've suddenly realized that there's beauty in mundane. In my life, I've experienced incredible health troubles, 2010, 2017, 2022. And so I remind myself and my family, I'm living grateful right now because I'm on my fourth life. When you're on your fourth life, you don't mind an average week. It's okay. You don't mind sitting around the dinner table with your family. You don't mind investing into people. You don't have a problem with creating a bit of margin in your life because that's mundane. That may look boring, but there is beauty in mundane. I want to speak to you if you're chasing the dream and you're leaving all the precious things behind. Pull yourself back and take hold of a bit of consistency. God can make things grow at a far greater rate than you can. A second thing about consistency is consistency moves forward little by little, and that's okay. And that's okay. Exodus 23 verse 30 says, little by little, I will drive them out before you until you have increased enough to take possession of the land. Proverbs 13 verse 11, wealth gained hastily will dwindle, but whoever gathers little by little will increase it. So many people in life are looking for the silver spoon or a gold bar that will drop out of heaven. And I think a kingdom principle is actually taking a long view on things and saying if God wanted to do it in a day, He can, He will, He must, but it's Him. But generally how God works, and it's because He's forming our characters, I think, He works in the little by little, and the little by little, and the day by day, and the week by week, month by month, year by year, and year on year, God's work begins to take. And before you know it, you begin to transform whole societies little by little. That's consistency. Someone said this: keep pushing the slow-moving flower wheel of faith, and eventually others will join you in your mission. I think far too many of us as leaders, we tap out because we look and we say, there's no momentum there, and surely I should be doing something differently. And actually that slow-moving flower wheel of faith, faith in the heart that says, God's called me to this, and I'm going to keep putting one foot in front of the other, 1 week on another, year on year. Before you know it, others are going to join you in the mission. You look back and you say, suddenly there's momentum. A third thing, consistency does the right things over and over again. And I put in brackets in my notes, not the wrong things. Because it's tempting to say, I'm doing these things over and over again. And maybe it takes someone to look in, or the Holy Spirit to whisper and say, you're doing these things over and over again, but are they the right things? Some of the right things that God's called me to do over and over again start in the devotional place. Start in the place of prayer. Start in the place of my personal administration at home, administration within leadership environments. Those are the things that are unseen. But they need to be done over and over again. I shared the story previously, but one of the things that I've found, and I'm talking from a church perspective, but apply it into your place. But when we started the church down in Durban, it was in 2015. And one of the things that you love when you're starting from scratch, you really love meeting new people. You, I guess, look in the mirror and say, what on earth are they doing here? How did they come? This is a huge privilege to have them. And so we'd run these new members' dinners, and they would come into our spaces, and fantastic to meet these people, and then to share something of our heart and the church's heart and where we come from and where we're going, etc., etc., etc. But I'll be honest with you and a bit vulnerable that by year 9 of giving the same speech over and over again, you get a bit bored of your own voice, hey? And you look at your wife and she is yawning. And she's not tired. And so then what I found myself doing is repackaging and looking at different ways to do the same thing, etc., etc., etc. And at one point I thought to myself, the only reason I'm changing this is because of myself and my wife. The people that come into our environment, they just appreciate the meal and the warmth and the love, and it's news to them. They've never heard it before, so why are you changing it? Consistency does the right things over and over again, not the wrong things. Number 4, consistency builds in lounges and around dining room tables. I always like to just give this a punt, because I think one of the ways that the slow revival happens in communities is not just in corporate meetings like this. It happens home to home to home to home. And it's incredible. Can I ask you, Barbara, could I ask you to stand very quickly? I don't mean to embarrass you. This is Barbara. She comes from Zimbabwe, Mutari. And it's wonderful to have you in our nation, firstly. We can give her a hand. While we were worshiping, I actually just felt like God wanting to refresh you and just to pour out His Spirit on you and refresh you. The backstory to Barbara, which I always remember when I see her and Andre, is Barbara and Brigitte, known as Bibi, walked into our church in Pietermaritzburg as 18-year-old young ladies. They come to Maritzburg to study nursing. And they sat in the third row, and in the second row, my parents, Andrew and Gadi, were attending church on a Sunday morning. And what they did is they turned around and they saw these young, lovely ladies. They introduced themselves and they said, why don't you come home for lunch or for tea or something like that. It was on their first or their second week at church. Amazing thing, and this has possibly nothing to do with my parents, but it's a little piece of the puzzle that builds into the kingdom, is that was their first week into a new community. Someone turns around, extends an invite, says, come into a home, and you look at what God does through all of that. Both of them have married pastors and are leading people in different nations of the world. You never know how powerful it can be. Not to preach this theological gospel that you don't even know about, but you can extend an invite and say, come into my space. I'll feed you. I'll love on you. I wanted to just say, sorry, I could have said you could sit down a lot sooner. You're looking exhausted after that little session. But I really felt like God just saying He wants to refresh you. Consistency builds in lounges and around dining room tables. My revelation around Zacchaeus, he's a short man. He needed Jesus. He needed Jesus to transform him, to change him from the inside out. And Jesus looks at him and He says, not another sermon you need. I'm coming to your house. We need a conversation. If you think the world needs more sermons, and sermons are good, it's the foolishness of preaching, but if it needs good sermons, then everyone should just trawl the internet. There's some really good preachers out there. There's a bit of trash as well, but there's some really good preachers. But I think what the world needs is more conversations. Consistency is always alert. Fifthly, consistency is always alert. 1 Peter 5 says, be alert and of sober mind. Your enemy, the devil, prowls around like a roaring lion looking for someone to devour. An amazing thing about being alert, I'm saying being consistently alert, because when we're on the success mountain, it's very tempting to just take the foot off the pedal. Or when I'm in the dungeon, to say, actually, I need to be alert. The devil's attacking me. I'm not saying that. I'm just saying consistently alert means understanding that the enemy's out to drag you down. He's out to devour you. He's out to rob, kill, and destroy you and I. And when we understand his work is to frustrate, we stand. We stand with the armor of God. We stand in our position as believers. And my son, my middle son, is actually preaching at youth tonight. Praying for those young people. But he's preaching and he says to me, his one point that he's going to preach about, he says this: know your enemy. So I wonder what he's going to say about that. He says, this is what I've thought about. When I know I'm playing cricket against a good school who've got a top opening bowler because he's an opening batsman, he says, I train differently that week. I said, what do you mean? He says, those guys that are really good, he tells me the one bowler, he says that they bounce you, they bowl with extra pace. I need to train a little bit extra that week. So I said, what does that look like? He says, well, I don't get Benji, the youngster, to throw at me. I get Jamie, the older brother, to throw at me. He bowls bounces at me. He tests me to the hilts. Profound. Why? Because we have an older brother. His name is Jesus. And you and I are not meant to train with the minions of the world. God's given us His Son in Jesus, who gets to train with us, who gets to spar with us, who gets to test us and mold us and make us so that we can stand. Consistency is always alert. And for the sake of time, I want to get into building with creativity. Firstly, creativity opens the fist of control. Pioneering opens the fist of control. It allows for others to come through. It considers others' ideas. It celebrates creativity that goes beyond my ability. Probably 2 years ago, I realized within our context, we had a core of about 5 or 6 elders, and 2 of them stepped aside for a season, for a period, for various reasons. And we run a few services at our church, and I remember looking at it thinking, oh my word, what are we going to do here? And instantly I felt God just say to me, look in your second row. And as we began to and for me, second row doesn't mean literal second row. I think it's just meaning, look at your core. Look at the guys that are chipping in. Look at the guys and ladies that their hearts are there. They want to lead with you. And as we began to do that, it's like God showed us a whole crop of new people that God wanted to use. And what it requires is opening, allowing others to come through, to give their ideas. And it's a beautiful thing. The second thing is that creativity acts in faith. I think one of the phrases of the New Testament of the disciples is this little phrase that says, help me overcome my unbelief. Help me overcome my unbelief. You see, faith isn't a natural lean of the Christian heart always. I think very often we lean toward unbelief. We lean toward presumption and just doing the same thing over and over. Faith is altogether different, and the disciples recognize that actually I need help to spark on the inside. For me, faith looks like when I am lighting the gas bright and I'm, pressing that the little buzzer thing, the igniter, and turning the dials, and it's not really working, and then it suddenly takes. Boof. That's faith. Faith is a gift from God. You and I need to cherish it and chase after it, because actually faith can transform environments. It can transform your future. It can make things that are distorted clear in a moment as faith sets in my heart. Without faith, it's impossible to please God. Third thing about creativity. Creativity looks for specks of gold. If you and I are waiting for the finished article, we may be waiting for a long time. I love the story in Judges chapter 7 of Gideon, where he's got all his men and they're going to go out and fight. And God says to them, whittle them down. You got too many. And he whittles them down all the way to 300 men. And for the sake of time, I won't tell you the story. But the thing that stands out to me about that story is a principle that says there's a difference between dignified men and desperate men. Dignified men, it had to do with the way that they drank their water, that they consumed, that they did life. And there was a little minority that were the specks of gold, that they just dived and plunged their heads into the source because they were thirsty, they were desperate, they needed what was in front of them. And God says, I'll take them. In their heart, there's desperation. I think the principle for us, the specks of gold, rather work with desperate people that we can dignify over time than dignified people that have no desperation. A fourth thing, as we draw this to a close, is that creativity leads counterintuitively. Counterintuitively. In other words, it goes against the grain. It goes in the opposite direction. That's creativity. That's pioneering. The amazing thing about Gideon, and I'll read this verse to close, is that fear seemed to be one of the things that whittled down that army. But then the angel of the Lord says to Gideon, if you are still afraid, this is what you to do. We read it. During that night, the Lord said to Gideon, get up, go down against the camp, because I am going to give it into your hands. If you are afraid to attack, go down to the camp with your servant Purah and listen to what they are saying. Afterward, you'll be encouraged to attack the camp. You see, to overcome his fear, he needed to recognize his fear, but to overcome it, he needed to go in the opposite direction. A fearful person runs away. God says, in your fear, run toward. And what he does is he doesn't give them the victory with swords and clubs and spears. He gives them the victory with this miracle of him hearing a dream. And in that dream, faith stirs his heart. He gets encouraged and God gets the victory. Creativity leads counterintuitively. Some of us need to hear that today. I'm not saying presumptuously, but some of us need to run in the opposite direction to what our instinct is telling us, because actually that's fear. God's saying run toward. And so to conclude, I feel God wanting to, and I'm going to pray if that's all right. Guy, that'd be all right. I feel God wanting to just encourage those who've possibly stopped building, where you've laid down your trowel, you've laid down your sword and your spear. And when we started at the Barnyard Theatre in Durban, we prepared well, we painted the town red, we invited people to this launch, and it so happened, because our life is spiritual, it's not physical. On the day when we prayed and fasted, on that Wednesday, we get the phone call to say they're not letting us meet there any longer. We've done all the advertising. We invited the whole of Durban to this thing. On that Wednesday, when we're praying and fasting, I tell you, that was one of the lowest moments of ministry for me. I lay on my bed and I did pray that prayer, Lord, take me now. People had changed jobs, they'd moved cities, they'd done all sorts for the kingdom, and now we're closing down. And I felt God remind me in that moment, Sanballat and Tobiah, they came upon the people that were building the wall in Nehemiah. And it says that they lifted up their swords in one hand and they built with their trowels in another. This is spiritual. And for some of us that have stopped building, we need to gain courage again today. I'd like to pray for you. Some of us have become blunt in our building. Maybe it's trauma, maybe it's boredom, it's routine, etc. And God wants to sharpen us up. And then lastly, if there's some of us that have been forcing growth, we do our part, which is managing faithfully, consistently. We do our part, which is pioneering and creatively looking for solutions. But ultimately, God makes things grow.